Diego Lipun of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. I would like to ask the panelists, to what extent in these success cases having a strong international research system was important, along with stronger national programs?
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate this book coming out. I think the timing of it couldn't be better, and I congratulate the authors on their originality. My name is Tom Herlihy. I'm from Land O'Lakes. I'm a little bit familiar with the dairy success story in East Africa. I have two questions. One is related to that. First of all, I appreciate the comments at the end of Simon's speech about organizing farmers into farmer-based organizations, cooperatives, or whatever, because in my experience and opinion, the reason the Kenya Dairy succeeded is because they got milk collection points, and that's what really linked them to the markets, and those were private sector, community-owned milk collection centers. And to me, that's what really catalyzed their integration into the market. As we all know, in Africa, people are isolated from markets, they're isolated from roads, and your point that this was a highly densely populated area close to markets is an excellent point. But I wanted to ask about finance. We keep hearing about access to finance, and I didn't hear those words here. Personally, I'm very gratified for that, because I don't think that is a key constraint to agricultural development in Africa. But I was just wondering if the panel could comment on access to finance and where it plays into the relationship in terms of incentives. Thank you.
Hi, Sudha Mayappan from Manchester Trade. I have a quick comment before the question. So when I hear the presentations, the point of having a technology, having markets, having the political will, it is not, you don't require a lot of research to come to these conclusions. It is definitely an obvious fact that you need all this. But having said that, in Africa, it's been so long and the process has been so arduous, but and there have been investments, but nothing has been as much as if this is so common and if this is what has to happen, what is actually stopping from an execution and the agriculture revolution taking up in a big way in Africa? So maybe it is a political will that is lacking, or is it focus on small farms and not on large farms? So thank you.
Julie Howard, Partnership to Cut Hunger and Poverty in Africa. I want to echo Tom's surprise at not hearing anything about finance. I'm interested in your comments, how technology actually is manifested through the value chain without finance, or maybe it's embedded in one of your lessons. But the second thing was, you know, Steve, you had talked about the importance of regional approaches, and you mentioned technology specifically. So do you have some comments on how well, we've had a number of regional institutions in place, so Asareka, CORAF in Africa, the CG Systems Center is also involved in regional transmission. What are the constraints that are affecting more rapid transmission of technology, since these things have been around now decades?
Hugo's question on, first of all, Hugo worked for the International Livestock Research Institute as the director of production systems, and so he knows very well the answer to his question about the role of how much impact have you had. I think the international research system played a good role. I mean, let's go beyond dairy. The IITA cassava mosaic disease. I mean, this is that impact was published in AJEA, I don't know which year, maybe around 1990, and it was a big hit. The return was 90%, because here you are, you don't do anything, you know, research has been done, and then they come and, you know, and spread the predators in your farm, and then the predators, you know, feed on the bug, okay, and then suddenly the farmer wake up in the morning, and then the yield is increasing again. So that's, I think, a clear case where international agricultural research played a very significant role. In the case of dairy, I mean, for many years, the International Laboratory for Research on Animal Diseases, which became ILRI, worked a lot with the Kenya Veterinary Services to actually do studies on how to combat those diseases. And information training, back and forth exchanges of knowledge have been shared back and forth. Sometimes those things are difficult to trace, but definitely the international research system did play a significant role in the process. And I think that's very much appreciated by the nationals, especially I want to say on the training. Like this study that we did here, for instance, the first author there at that time was a PhD student, Makerere University, from Uganda. The second author was a Sudanese postdoc at ILRI. The third author was me, but the fourth author was a postdoc, a research assistant from Ethiopia. And these are people now back into their own systems, working after receiving this kind of training. So I mean, there's a lot of action that's taking place back and forth that we need to appreciate. Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to take the question on why finance did not come out as a I think when I think about finance, it also reminds me about the question on tenure that also often come up here and there. I mean, not that they are not constrained, they are, but the question is at which stage in the process are they becoming a real constraint, Because sometimes you do have some basic preliminary constraint that you need to be able to eliminate: access to technology, productivity, market incentives, before even the finance becomes an issue. Okay, so and if you notice, the private sector in Kenya, in dairy sector, developed in Ethiopia also, despite the absence of formalized finance, because people were able to actually mobilize resources in different ways. Okay, people have you can have some supply chain type of lending that can happen, and the private sector, the commercial banks, are able to respond in a certain cases to provide the lending when it's needed, when you can, because they see profitability, they see that this guy has access to technology, this guy is able to provide, there's a profit that can be generated, and then they provide the resources. So don't mistake me. I mean, the finance is important, but it may not be the number one constraint. Okay, it's something that can come down the road.
Okay, I'll pick up a couple others. On the international research, Hugo, virtually all of these there was a connection. So you can take credit for a lot of these. The question about political will, why hasn't this happened? If it's so easy to do this, why isn't Africa look like the Garden of Eden? And I think the answer is political will. I think Africa was a land surplus continent for many years. When Asian countries became independent, it was the Great Bengal Famine. Southeast Asia swore from independence they would never let food production get out of their control. In Africa, they had abundant food at independence, and so they didn't have a similar political compulsion. And in Africa's case, coming later and from a more favorable resource endowment point of view, attained independence at a time when the donors were saying, agriculture, are you kidding? That's not how England developed. They had industrial revolutions. Forget agriculture. So they had neither the domestic political constituency nor really strong support from the outside. So I think Africa got religion late in the game. I think basically it took a world food crisis a couple years ago to really crystallize people's resolve, both within Africa and within the donor community. And it's that confluence of common interest in agriculture that I think makes this coming decade a very exciting one, because I think people on both sides are now persuaded that they've ignored agriculture for a long time at their peril. Julie's question about the regional, it's really important. My conclusion is the same as Mo Ibrahim, if you read him. Do you know Mo? He's the Sudanese cell phone billionaire that gives these prizes for good governance, and he hasn't given any for the last 2 years because he says there's nobody worthy. He has a nice quote from a few months ago saying that Africa can't compete as 54 tiny microscopic countries. They're too small. They have to develop regional markets. The best example I've seen is in electricity. 40% of African countries are so small that they use these small diesel generators to generate power. It's the most expensive electric power on Earth is in Africa, despite the largest hydroelectric capacity. And it's because you've got 50 tiny little countries, and each one has a tiny little generator. Well, there are huge economies of scale in power generation. They need regional markets. This is the conclusion of the World Bank's infrastructure study. If Africa wants to compete, the most important ingredient is regional trade in electric power. Now, that's not something you really normally think of as a traded commodity, but it's really central. The same is true for agricultural products, and it's particularly true for ag research, because you've got, across the Sahel, you've got 8 countries, same agroecology, but 8 different or even a dozen different national research stations and a dozen directors, and the economies of scale just aren't there. So I think the spillovers from research are huge. The rule of thumb is they'll double your productivity gains if you look to attain those from the beginning. The reason it doesn't happen, number one, is language. Got French and English and Portuguese countries. Number two is finance, because only 4 African countries have met their CADUP targets, funding 10% for agriculture. And they don't have enough money for their own system. They're not about to fund regional programs. Okay, they have a domestic constituency first. So in practice, my reading of the experience is that regional programs have worked when they've had donor funding. They almost have to have it, at least to start off. So I think it's been financial support. Donors haven't funded agriculture, let alone regional programs. Even I'm worried because this 20 billion in funding, people are talking about country-led, 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 and not so many are talking about regional programs. And that funding's going to have to come from the donors, or it's not going to happen.
Peter?
Let me just pick up on that question. Why isn't happening? Why isn't it happening? I heard a little bit more criticism in there. Hey, what you're saying is old stuff. We already know this. If it's only the old stuff, why isn't it happening? Let's remember that these successes happened in an environment where most other agricultural projects and endeavors were failing around them. So there was something unique that happened that made these successes, and I think it really is because, you know, these old things, they all came together in the right way at the same place at the right time. Think of the market chain. You've got every link in the market chain, from the farmer to the final retail establishment, has to be in place for that market chain to really work. If any of those links are broken, it doesn't happen. So you could have 90% of the links, but if you don't have the key one, nothing happens. So you've got a lot of projects going on that have got broken chains and they didn't take off. These are cases where things did come together, and in a pretty unfavorable environment with all the failures around it. It's maybe one reason credit isn't showing up much, because the credit institutions were failing. These successes evolved and adapted in an environment where there wasn't no good credit. So they found other ways of dealing with that problem, which is why it doesn't jump out at you as, you know, a credit institution playing a big role. But it is old stuff, and that's the real problem. That it's not just lack of political will, it's a donor problem. Donors don't like old things, they want new things. I have a lot to do with DFID these days, and DFID always wants to be on the frontier with the new idea. You know, whether it's sustainable livelihoods, it's going to solve everything, the new approach. Now it's adaptation to climate change. If only we focus on that, then we'll solve all of Africa's problems. Nobody wants to talk about roads and agricultural research, you know, all these very old things. But those are the things that really transform agriculture. And it's getting back to the old things and making them come together in the integrated way that makes a difference. So the real challenge, I think, is how to make the new old things the new fad. The new things are going to be the old things. Then we can succeed.
Thank you. Raquel Gomes with Oxfam America. And just building on, I love going back to the old. And it's amazing how Washington doesn't think about the old. And I don't know if it's because it's ignorance or they're just not asking. But when I think of old, and I'm always struck by what AID did back in the 70s and 80s through the land grant schools, and it's fascinating stuff. I'm particularly familiar with the Latin America work. Going back to your successes, I haven't read the book yet, just the little summary, but I said, oh, there's got to be a story here. I know there's going to be a story about long-term institutional engagement between some university, some land grant university, give me one, and an African institution. Tell me what that story is.
Philip Church. I'm a former former ag economist from USAID back when that breed was still alive in the 70s and 80s. One of the words that I haven't heard from the two authors today is risk and risk management.
Speak a little louder.
Risk and risk management. And in small farm agriculture in Africa, that always has been an important consideration. You move farmers from subsistence to commercial agriculture, you introduce the added risks of markets, particularly if purchased inputs are involved, you introduce the risk of financial failure. There was a slide put up here earlier showing the benefits of planting early and harvesting early, but if you're the farmer that gets out in front of the other farmers, yours becomes the first crop that's attacked by pests. And so one of the reasons farmers plant and harvest collectively in certain regions is to spread that risk. And I was just curious to know from the authors, to what extent did you include or factor in risk and risk management in your success stories?
Yes, my name is Michael Kaczynski. I teach global studies at Gardner-Webb University. I guess I wanted to know some basics. For instance, when looking at that first chart of roller coasters and rockets, could you extrapolate what's what? In other words, are we looking at 95% of African agriculture that you looked at through your study being roller coasters, and these anomalies that you were looking at might mean 5%? I'm sure that you covered a variety of different types of commodities on purpose. Were certain ones more advantageous as you were looking across various commodities than others? Were certain regions, you mentioned regional development, were certain regions more progressive in the research that you identified? Just some kind of context from what you were looking at and sharing.
Thank you. Am I missing any hands over here? If not, I have a question too for you, Steve. It's a twofold question. Independence was about 50 years ago. 50 years is a very long time for political wills to still not really be crystallized in Africa. 2-3 generations go by. And I'm still puzzled why in Africa we, and I'm an African from Kenya, why we ourselves do not want or do not invest in our own agriculture. 50 years later, I can understand 1950s and 60s, but why now, after the 70s, 80s, 90s, we've seen the consequences of the lack of investment? Why still are we not scaling up our own investment and waiting for an external community or external donors? And I struggle with that, and I struggle with Peter's very interesting, Christmas trees flashing. And how do we have enough power to keep those Christmas trees no longer flashing, but continually bright? From the work that you did, the consultations that you had in Africa, and the public awareness and so forth, where do you see energy coming out of these consultations? in terms of real sort of wanting to invest more in Africa by Africans? Or do you see, oh yeah, we understand, yeah, we need political will, yeah, but. So I'm just curious, you know, after major exercise, a lot of NEPAD, CADEP work building around this, taking this up, do you see any glimmers of even changes in thinking in Africa? And that's a politically loaded question, but I'm just curious. Let me turn over to the three of you. And I don't know if you want to go in reverse order or start again with Semeyon and come back up.
Talk about the long-term institutional engagement. You asked this question. I think it's an interesting question because it's true that you know, many universities, especially land-grant universities in the U.S. here, for instance, have had some engagement in some countries over the years, and I can tell you that you will see that many leaders in agriculture today in Africa have come from this kind of exchanges. I mean, Michigan State is one case in point where many people have graduated from, and they are now leaders in their own countries, and also you have had that many people who have also gone to Europe and come back and so on, and I think the key point now is that yeah, those countries have evolved, and 50 years from now, what is being done even within the countries or region to be able to actually create more synergies around that. The question is really how long can this continue, and what can countries do regionally to be able to actually tap those resources? That's why the issue about having some regional approach to solving some of the problems in the countries will be useful, in my view. Some people do come still, but a lot of countries have increased in terms of their per capita income, in terms of their development, and you do have countries like South Africa and others that are done quite well, that are actually providing regional kind of training. I think that we need to put more emphasis in that also, in creating opportunity for many of the young people to actually develop. But the engagement between the university in the US and Africa has bears a lot of very positive fruit, I have to say. And today, all this analysis, all kind of the work that's being done in the continent is also a derivation of this kind of trend that has taken place over the years. Why 50 years from now? I mean, 50 years. 50 years have passed, and then countries that have not invested in their agriculture. I mean, this is really a $1 billion question, and I think that's one reason why we are this book came out to raise awareness. I think people are aware of that. We also have to take into account the context of the evolution of many of these countries, and the political system are evolving. Many of them are now becoming a bit more democratic. The civil societies, is really developing, raising awareness to people, the leaders. So there are changes that are taking place that we need to also recognize. It doesn't happen overnight. Peter said it takes time. 50 years is a long time, but it's not enough. So let's continue create this raising the awareness, and things are changing. I mean, the CADEP process that's taking place, for instance, it's something that never occurred before. I was part of the review process of a meeting that took place in Dakar. Okay, and it was very rigorous, where they tried to really help countries develop their own country investment plan. And this process is something that is on the positive side, I have to say, and countries are taking it serious. So something's happening. Let's not shoot ourselves in the hips and say that nothing's happening. There's some progress, but we need to be patient. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll just endorse what Simeon said, Raquel, about the institution building. You asked for 3 examples, so I'm going to give you 3 examples. First one is Simone Hui, PhD from Purdue University, one of the leading lights in Africa today. It's a loss that they bank put him into South Asia. But a lot of the impact from the land grant system is, in fact, people like Simeon, and you find them all over in Africa, and they're really playing a major role. But that funding was from the 60s and 70s. We're missing about a generation because we haven't really invested in that. Two other good examples from the 60s. Michigan State University set up the University of Nigeria in Nsukka. It's their first agricultural college and the first one of many that they set up. And Yina Chuda and others went on to become vice chancellors of that university system. Francis Hida Chaba. You got some real leaders coming out of that early investment. Third example, Oklahoma State University helped set up the Alamayo Agricultural University in Ethiopia. Same story there. You get a generation of trained technicians that then go on to provide leadership. But there's been a fall off in those efforts. So I'd say there's need to recharge the banks, particularly since the technology has changed so much. There's a new generation of science. The biology's changed a lot. And so I think there is going to need to be really a whole new generation of scientists trained in the latest biological technologies. Paul's question about risk, yes, it matters a great deal. It comes in particularly in the cotton case studies, in the maize, and in the conservation farming. And a lot of those soil management techniques are aimed at increasing soil organic matter and allowing farmers to survive spotty rainfall years and so on. So absolutely risk is a big issue, and you need to master it in ways that are affordable and manageable by small farmers. And it's a challenge, but it is possible. Michael's question about how many roller coasters do we have and how many rocket ships, really, you're going to have to read the whole book, I think, if you're an academic. In aggregate, we have a lot more roller coasters. You look at the average productivity in cereal production, that's kind of the standard one, and it's more or less flat at a little over 1 ton per hectare over the last 50 years. So on average, you've had many more roller coasters than rocket ships. Rajul's question, always big thinker, big picture. I have two answers to why the first generation neglected agriculture for the reasons I cited earlier. They didn't have the need, and the outsiders told them it was not worthwhile. We're on probably, what, the second, third generation? I think the current generation faces two problems. Number one is they all grew up in the cities. These kids grew up without ever getting their hands dirty. Now, the first generation political leaders grew up in rural areas. Their hearts were there. They spent the weekends there. And by and large, most African leaders today did not do that. And their kids go to fancy boarding schools, and agriculture is old-fashioned, and they want nothing to do with it. So I think there's a real disdain among the African intelligentsia that minimizes the importance of agriculture. The second thing is farm lobbies. Where you have strong political voice, you do get responsive governments. In two of the case studies we had, it was very clear. This maize in Zimbabwe and the dairy in Kenya, it was farmer lobbies that really brought the political will to bear to invest for 30 to 80 years in these complicated artificial insemination and breeding systems and monitoring, keeping the stud books and monitoring the milk offtake of different progeny. It was a big investment, and it took a lot of time, but they had a political voice that got the attention of the policymakers. So in cases where farmers have political voice, they do get responses. And you look at countries like Uganda, Kenya are good examples of where you do really have a very committed political leadership interested in investing in agriculture. But in a lot of cases, farmers are marginalized. They are important only at election time. And so it's free food in election years, and other than that, we can ignore them. So this whole political system is an important part of whose attention the policymakers address.
Thank you. Peter? Thank you, Steve.
They haven't left much for me. I think risk, yes, important. In this case, it was handled through the technology rather than through the marketing institutions. But as Steve indicated, many of these technologies doubled or tripled production yields. They didn't necessarily increase risk. In some cases, like conservation farming, they actually reduced it. So big increase in yield without any increase in risk. That was a technological solution to the problem. But more generally, yes, I think risk is a big issue for Africa, and there will need to be institutional arrangements to deal with it if it can't always be solved through technology. I don't know the simple answer to why African leaders don't do more for ag. I think really in Asia you had champions for the Green Revolution. There were national champions at high levels. Sometimes they were ministers, sometimes they were permanent secretaries. But these were individuals who had vision, who were very committed, and who drove the thing. And they had the support of donors. But having African champions is fundamental, and I just don't see them, and that's my worry. Even with the CADAP process, I'm seeing process, I'm not seeing champions, and I think you need both. So I'm still worried about it, but it doesn't help that the donors have told African leaders that agriculture is not important for 20 years, and it doesn't help that we bail them out with food every time they have a shortage. It's much easier to put out the begging bowl for food and keep their own money to spend on other things that they prefer, like shiny new airports and nice new tanks. And that was another difference in Asia. But again, the food crisis of 2 years ago, 1 year ago now, 08, 09. I mean, it's for the first time in a long time, African leaders were confronted with a situation where food prices were very high and they weren't assured adequate supplies from abroad. And it got their attention. Suddenly they all started talking about agriculture again. So maybe there's a lesson from that.